Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're tackling something I think a lot of us are really into. The evolution of electronic music production. You send in a blog post, and man, this timeline is packed with gear. It's really wild to see how some machines basically gave birth to whole genres.
Yeah, and we're going to try to unpack all that.
Yeah, exactly. See how these machines with their sounds and grooves changed music forever. And I think the surprising part is they still influence producers today.
You know, it's so interesting how these sounds have just embedded themselves in our musical subconscious. Like, you hear a particular drum pattern and boom, you're instantly, like transported back to a time or a place, even if you don't even know what machine made it.
It's so true. You just feel it. And speaking of iconic sounds, the blog post really dives into Roland, right? Especially the TR-808. I mean, it's more than a drum machine at this point.
Right.
It's practically a legend.
A legend, yeah. I think what's interesting about the 808 is like its journey. It went through these price swings, became super scarce, and then that made it even more desirable.
Oh, for sure.
So you combine that scarcity with its unique sound, it's just fueled its iconic status. And even now, with all these advancements, producers are still chasing that 808 sound.
It's almost like a cultural artifact now.
Yeah.
It's so much more than just the gear itself. And
Yeah.
it's not just the 808, right? I mean, the whole Roland family.
Yeah.
The 909 with its, I don't know, those hard-hitting kind of like industrial sounds.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the cornerstone of techno.
Absolutely.
And the 707 with its snappy, bright sounds.
Yeah.
Perfect for like early house music. I mean, they all left their mark.
Yeah.
But the 808 is the one that really just, I think, sunk its teeth into our collective musical DNA.
I think the 808's impact is undeniable, and it brings up a really important point. It's not just the individual sounds these machines made, it's about the feel, the groove they had. And, think about the Akai MPC series, which the author talks about
Oh, yeah.
a lot. And he mentions instantly recognizing that MPC groove.
That's right. That little anecdote about teaching at point blank and like immediately hearing a student using an MPC and just knowing it was that MPC swing,
Right.
never even having used one himself. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes about how deep those rhythms are embedded in these certain genres.
Yeah, it really does. And Akai, especially with the MPC 60 and 3000, they just offered this combination of swing and sound that became synonymous with hip-hop.
Oh, yeah.
And later on, even like house music. The way the MPC sequences rhythms, that quantized function, the way it handles timing, created a feel that was as important as the drum sounds themselves.
So we have Roland kind of shaping the sound of genres like techno and house with its drum machines.
Right.
And Akai laying down this rhythmic foundation for hip-hop and house with the MPC groove.
Yeah.
It seems like this evolution of electronic music was this constant back and forth between like sonic texture and rhythmic innovation.
Exactly. And that quest for unique sounds and grooves wasn't just limited to Roland and Akai. Companies like Lin and Emu were out there pushing the boundaries too.
Let's talk about them because they don't get as much attention,
Yeah.
but they were definitely huge.
Right.
So what makes them stand out?
Well, Lin, with their Lindrum and LM2, they had a massive influence, especially on like the 80s sound.
Oh, yeah.
They offered these really punchy, pristine drums, a clean, very precise sound that really cut through the mix.
Right.
Think of like classic synth pop tracks or early house music. That crisp drum sound often came from a Lin machine.
So while Roland was laying down the foundation for these like harder edge genres,
Uh-huh.
Lin was providing the sonic signature for this more polished, kind of like pop-infused sound.
Yeah, exactly.
What about Emu? They seem to have this completely different vibe.
Yeah, Emu, especially with their SP12 and SP1200 samplers, they brought this raw, gritty edge to the table. Less polished, more lo-fi and warm, and that just became an essential part of early hip-hop. And even house music.
Yeah.
Even today, producers are drawn to that SP1200 grit,
I love it.
that almost like vintage warmth.
Yeah.
It pops up in all sorts of sample-based music.
It's so interesting how these companies, even though they're working with similar technology,
Right.
they carved out their own niches,
Yeah.
their own sonic identities. It's like they each had their own perspective on how electronic music should sound and feel.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating because these machines weren't just tools, they were like part of the creative process.
Right.
They had these limitations, quirks, and those limitations actually pushed producers to be more resourceful, more creative.
Oh, yeah.
They had to work within those constraints of the machine to get the sound they wanted.
Right.
And a lot of times that led to these unexpected and innovative results.
It's like happy accidents.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's amazing how like a machine's limitations can actually spark creativity.
Right.
Almost like having, a built-in collaborator pushing you in new directions.
Yeah.
But the author eventually moves away from hardware, first to clones, and then now it seems like he's using almost entirely high-quality samples.
Yeah.
So do you think those creative limitations disappear when you're working with like almost this infinite palette of sounds?
That's a really great question. And it's something that I think a lot of producers think about a lot. There is a certain, I don't know, magic to those old machines
Oh, for sure.
wrestling with their limitations. But, I think this move to samples, it kind of represents this natural evolution, right? It's about access and possibility. Companies like Samples from Mars and Goldbaby, they've done an amazing job of capturing not just the sounds of these machines, but the feel too.
It's not just about having a library of drum sounds. It's about having access to those grooves. Like the author talks about using groove templates from Samples from Mars in his own productions. Have you experimented with those at all?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Those are game changers. I mean, think about it. You can literally have the exact swing of the MPC 60
Right.
or the precise timing of a TR-909 all inside your computer, your digital audio workstation. It's pretty incredible. It lets you blend those classic feels with new sounds. So you're creating these hybrids that would have been basically impossible before. It's like having this direct line to the rhythmic DNA of these legendary machines.
I love that, the rhythmic DNA. It's almost like democratizing these sounds too, you know what I mean?
Right.
You don't need thousands of dollars for vintage gear to kind of tap into that legacy. You can experiment with those grooves, learn from them, and then hopefully build on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings up this, interesting debate, right? So some people will say that, relying on these samples stifles originality. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I see both sides. On one hand, if you're just recreating like note for note classic tracks using samples, yeah, it can feel a little derivative. But I think the real potential is using these as like raw materials,
Yeah.
as building blocks. It's like you're not just sampling a sound, you're sampling like an approach to rhythm,
Yeah.
a way of thinking about the groove.
I agree completely. It's about taking those classic elements and filtering them through your own lens,
You're right.
blending them with your ideas, your sonic palette.
So it's kind of like these high quality samples and groove templates are actually expanding the legacy of these machines, keeping them relevant, and kind of inspiring a whole new generation.
Yeah.
It's not about just replicating the past.
Right.
It's about using the past to fuel the future, which is really cool.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder what's going to be like the 808 of the future. What new tools or techniques are going to come out and
Yeah.
define the sound of electronic music in the coming years?
That's the exciting part. We just don't know.
Yeah.
But if you look at the trajectory, it's clear that innovation is key. Each of these companies, Roland, Akai, Lin, Emu, they all pushed boundaries. They weren't content with just the status quo.
Right.
They were constantly experimenting, taking risks, and, ultimately that's what kind of revolutionized music production.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it's not just about the technology itself, it's about how artists use it, right? Like, think about how the 808, with that deep, booming bass
Oh, yeah.
became so central to hip hop. It was more than just like a drum sound.
It was a statement.
It was a statement, an embodiment of a whole cultural movement.
It's true. It's that interplay between like technology and artistry. That's what makes electronic music so compelling.
Right.
The machines provide the tools, but it's the human element, the creativity, the innovation that really brings it to life.
Right. And the tools are constantly evolving. And the blog post even mentions Electron, which seems to be kind of carrying the torch of innovation these days, especially in groove-based sequencing.
Yes. I feel like Electron is on everyone's radar right now.
Yeah.
They're kind of building on the legacy
Yeah.
of those classic groove boxes,
Right.
but they're adding their own like little twist to it. What makes them so unique?
Well, their sequencers are incredibly powerful and, flexible.
Okay.
They allow for just this depth of experimentation with rhythm and timing. It's not just about programming a beat. It's about creating these like complex evolving patterns that feel almost organic.
So they're not just recreating old sounds. They're actually
Yeah.
like pushing the boundaries of what's possible rhythmically.
Exactly. And their sound engines are like incredibly versatile too. You can get anything from like gritty industrial textures to like warm melodic tones.
Oh, wow.
It's like they combined like all the best aspects of those classic groove boxes with modern sound design.
It sounds like they're really pushing the envelope.
Yeah.
Blending, kind of the familiar with the cutting edge, but I've heard they're like notoriously complex.
Yeah.
Is it easy to kind of get lost in all that depth?
Yeah, the learning curve can be a little steep,
Yeah.
but I think that's part of the appeal.
Okay.
They really reward exploration and
I
experimentation.
like that.
And there's a huge online community
That's great.
dedicated to, helping people master these machines.
So it's like any, really powerful tool. It's like a initial investment,
Hmm.
but the payoff could be huge.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're looking for something that's going to challenge you creatively and push you to think outside the box rhythmically, Electron is worth checking out.
So we've talked about like the lasting influence of those classic drum machines, samplers, the rise of high quality samples and groove templates, and now, this continued evolution with companies like Electron. It's quite a journey. It really shows how these core elements like rhythm, groove, and sound design, they just keep shaping electronic music. It doesn't matter how much the technology changes. But there's this one thing in the blog post that I keep thinking about. The author basically says that with the quality of samples and groove templates we have today, you almost don't even need the original hardware anymore. What do you think about that?
It's a pretty bold statement, and I think it really gets to the heart of this debate that's been going on forever in electronic music. There are purists out there who think nothing can replace working on those old machines.
Yeah.
That tangible, hands-on interaction.
I totally get that. I mean, there's definitely this romanticism around those old machines, a sense of history, authenticity. But then I also think, that perspective can be kind of limiting too. Like, if you can really capture the soul of a TR-808 or an SP-1200 digitally, and then use that to make something new and innovative, isn't that just as valid?
It's a really good question. I think in the past, access to these iconic sounds was limited, right? You had to have the money, the gear had to be available.
Right.
But now with these amazing samples and emulations, those barriers are gone. And that opens up so many creative doors, especially for producers who, maybe can't afford a room full of vintage gear.
It's like we've gone from this era of scarcity to an era of abundance. So instead of being limited by what one piece of hardware can do, now producers can pull from this huge library of sounds and grooves. I mean, they can combine things in ways that people never even thought of before.
And that brings a whole new set of challenges.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how do you navigate all of these possibilities?
Right.
How do you find your own voice when you're working with all these iconic sounds?
Yeah, it's almost overwhelming, I bet.
It can be. The author even says working with samples can lead to these creative paths that you wouldn't have found with the original hardware.
So it's like taking those classic sounds as a starting point. You're not just copying them, you're reinterpreting them, twisting them, warping them, mixing them with your own ideas. It's really cool.
Yeah, it becomes less about the tools themselves and more about the artist's vision. Those old machines had their own unique charm, their quirks,
Right.
but they also had their limitations. And samples, they give you this flexibility, this control that can be freeing.
So it's not about just replacing the old with the new. It's about using the old to shape the new, kind of bridge the gap between the past and the future of electronic music production.
Yeah, I think that sums it up perfectly. The legacy of these machines, it goes beyond the physical hardware, right? And
Yeah.
their impact lives on in all the tracks they inspired, the genres they helped create, and, in the hearts of all those producers who are still inspired by those sounds.
And thanks to technology, that inspiration is more accessible than ever. Who knows what amazing music is going to come out of this new era of music production?
It's an exciting time to be making music. And, as we've seen, the journey is just as important as the destination. So, keep experimenting, keep exploring, keep pushing those boundaries. And to everyone listening out there, here's something to think about. What will be the next iconic sound or groove to shape electronic music? What new innovations will capture the imaginations of producers and listeners? The journey continues.